for discussion today is making London a smart city, digital connectivity and regeneration. But first, we have a few short items of formal business to deal with. So if you can bear with us, we shall do that first. Please make sure that your electronic devices are either switched off or are on silent mode to avoid any unnecessary interruption. Item 1. Do we have any apologies for absence?
We do, thank you, Chair. Apologies have been received from Assembly Member Devenish, and Assembly Member Boff is attending as a substitute for him today.
Thank you, Assembly Member Boff, for reserving. Item number 2, declarations of interest. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out in item 2? Can I also ask members to declare any other disclosable interests which you might have, which are not on the register, which are pertinent to today's agenda? Anything to declare? No? Swiftly moving on to item 3. Can we confirm the minutes of the meeting of the Regeneration Committee held on 21st of November 2017 to be signed by me as a correct record? Thank you very much. I shall do that. Summary list of actions. Can we note the completed and ongoing actions arising from previous meetings of this committee? Thank you. Item number 5, actions taken under delegated authority. Can we note that actions taken by me under delegated authority following consultations with Deputy Chair Sean Bailey, namely to agree the arrangements for our site visit to Croydon Town Centre on 6th of December 2017. Okay. Can we also note the summaries of our site visits to Brent Cross, Cricklewood and Croydon Town Centre attached to our report as Appendix 1 and Appendix 2 of this report? Yeah. Thank you. Regeneration Committee. Right. Before I move on to the other item which we will take later on, can we move now on to item number 6, which is making London a smart city, digital connectivity and regeneration. This is our main item of discussion today, and can I welcome our guests to the meeting and invite them to introduce themselves. Shall we start with Dr. Katherine Willis, please?
So I'm Dr. Katherine Willis, Associate Professor in the School of Art, Design and Architecture at Plymouth University.
Thank you very much.
Theo, Blackwell, I'm the Chief Digital Officer here at City Hall.
I'm Stephen Lorimer and I'm the Smart London Strategy and Delivery Officer here at City Hall.
Thank you very much. You're very welcome to this committee, and thank you for sparing your time and bringing in your expertise. Can I start with introduction as well as I have a few questions as the opening cluster of our assessment of the issue. As an introduction, London's digital connectivity snapshot gives an alarming picture of poor connectivity across London. Even locations such as Westminster, Southwark, the City of London have not spots. Those are the areas of digital deserts in our city. London lacks extensive full fibre connections. Spain, for example, has 83% of all its buildings connected to pure fibre, but the UK has only 3%, and that doesn't feature large sections of London. Within the country itself, London is ranked 30th out of 63 cities across the UK for high-speed broadband coverage. The Mayor, in his letter to this committee, recognizes the barriers to digital connectivity and the need to address the issues to maintain London's status as global city as well as world's leading tech centre. So, having got the kind of scenario pictured, I'll start with my question to Theo Blackwell. In August last year, the Mayor appointed you as London's first Chief Digital Officer. to address the connectivity issues and his vision. Can you please explain to the committee what is your role as the Chief Digital Officer?
Thank you for this opportunity to give evidence to the committee. I've certainly have read your report on digital connectivity, and that forms a very, very significant part of my role. Let me just explain the broad job description that I have and how it relates to the development of the new Smart London plan. The role of the Chief Digital Officer was called for by a consortium of business community and also public service organisations to address the collaboration deficit that we perceive in London between public services and essentially mobilising the tech, the power and ingenuity of the tech community. And so our aim is to forge a greater sense of purpose for the city and partnerships in order to address and develop London's new smart vision. The Chief Digital Officer role was in the manifesto, both of Labour and Conservative candidates at the election, and very much shaped by the work of London First and Bloomberg Associates at the time, and I may add progressive boroughs who were arguing for these things. So my role has three main facets in the job description. One is leadership, second promoting collaboration, and third promoting innovation. And I'll briefly just mention those 3 points and how they relate. The leadership piece has two main facets. One is providing strategic alignment across mayors' strategies and duties, so that we're talking about smart data and digital in a consistent and understood way across City Hall. Secondly, it's to build capacity of the senior team here and to develop digital leadership programs that we can then take across the city, working with the NHS and other public service partners. And indeed, today is the second session of a senior leadership, a digital leadership a training program with Everyone. The second main aspect of my job is collaboration, and that's forging a coalition of the willing across London's public services. So that's working with councils that have and other public services that have already made significant steps in this direction to see if we can scale innovation in the right way, develop common standards and common approaches to the problems that we've identified. And the third part, which becomes more important during the Brexit negotiations, is supporting the work of the Deputy Mayor for Business and the advisor for business, Ben Johnson, on promoting London's innovation story globally. London, of course, has a huge range of innovation coming from the private and public sectors, and it's our job to really showcase that. And obviously we have London Tech Week and a number of functions there. Those three number of events there that are coming up. Those three aspects of my job flow into a new articulation of Smart London. London, of course, has had a previous vision for a smart city in 2013, following on from the New York model, which was put out in 2011. It's now time for us to update that in the light of experience of other smart cities, and this conversation is part of that. We hope to launch the new Smart London vision at London Tech Week in June with the Mayor, and last week we launched a listening exercise. 10 days ago we launched a listening exercise for the tech community and practitioners to come up with practical measures that London can take to enable us to meet this smarter vision. That will cover a discussion around how we get better collaboration between the tech sector and the public sector, how we talk about data in the light of the new data laws coming in, GDPR, how we establish world-class connectivity in this city and eliminate not spots, mobilising, of course, public assets that have been underutilised for that job, and also prepare for 5G, how, in the light of devolution, we really focus on skills, which is core business, of course, for the Mayor now, because of devolution, and then how we talk about design and respecting diversity in new digital services, which is the fifth enabler that we've identified in the plan. I've published this in draft form on Medium, circulated it to the committee, And we hope to have full engagement with, of course, the London Assembly and elected members right across the city on Smart Vision.
Well, thank you for that. Given the sort of detailed work that you have given to us as to what your role is, and given that this is a new role, can you tell us how is it resourced? Tell us about your team to support your work, which is quite extensive, like you said, and the work you've undertaken to date to promote Mayor's vision for Smart London.
Okay, it's a new role, so I would characterise the establishment of the first Chief Digital Officer role for London as we're in the phase of sort of institution building, if you like. I sit on the 8th floor. My job description details that I will work closely with the digital transformation lead in the authority, which does external facing work, technology group, and also the assistant director for intelligence, city data, essentially. So those are they are not job reports to me, but they are identified parts of the GLA. So my role is primarily a citywide digital leadership role, and we hope in the future that a number of initiatives will come to light, which will then be resourced by the mayor. The chief of these is something that has been being developed, and has been developed over the last 14 months. In my previous role, as an elected representative in Camden, I was the lead for digital for London councils, and we were working at the time with City Hall to develop essentially a collaboration vehicle for public services to come together to identify use cases of the kind of things that we need to do collectively, such as the development of common standards, data sharing, digital leadership training, work on connectivity such as standardised way leaves and such like, and support for local councils to develop and articulate their own particular digital vision appropriate to their setting. We're Dr. Lorimer here, ably assisted by Dr. Lorimer, who's has published international comparisons on digital strategies. We're doing the first piece of research which looks at where the boroughs are on their digital strategies, which will be published late February. Yeah. So at the moment, what we're doing is finding out, pretty much for the first time, how people are articulating their digital vision, finding commonality, and trying to provide some support for people on that journey. I sort of say finding out for the first time with a bit of a caveat, because everyone's going through essentially the digital revolution, and so what people said about digital in 2014, I was the author of Camden's strategy in 2014, is pretty much outdated now. So this is very much a moving feast, and so what we're trying to do is provide a sense of place where people can come together, exchange ideas, what's the best approach to connectivity, digital inclusion, and ensure that we do so in a collaborative and using, in a common way, basically.
Is your role full-time and for the rest of the mayoral term?
It's full-time paid member of staff.
And for the duration?
It's a full-time post, civil service post in this administration, yeah.
I'll come up in the next section, actually.
Okay,
yeah.
No problem.
Sorry, on the London Office for Technology Innovation, which is the collaboration vehicle, we hope to put forward a joint bid with London councils and the Mayor of London at some future stage, and we have been talking to the chief executives of London Committee about that.
On kind of broad principle, kind of as such, what do you think? What else can be done to increase fibre uptake by developers? This is something where we are way behind, and something needs to be done to really push that agenda forward very quickly?
We are developing a plan which is confusingly called Connected London, which has the same title as an initiative from TfL, so we may well come up with another title for that, and that will emerge in the next couple of weeks from Jeremy Skinner's team here. I think the Smart London, I think first of all what we need to do is set a very clear purpose that can be easily understood both by the private sector and the public sector, a range of expectations on developers. And in my first week in the job, the draft London plan was being sort of consulted on internally, and I went through into the planning document to provide challenge on the language that was that we were using. Now, the London plan is built upon previous iterations, and so to a certain extent it's sort of like layers of paint, and the language that was used in there I provided some challenge to, so we could have more consistency and more up-to-date language around this. And secondly, in section 9 we've updated our planning approach to this, so developers will have a clear idea of.
On London plan we have specific questions which we will come on later on as to how it's different from...
So that's a very important vehicle for us to do that. Secondly, a clear sense of purpose through the Smart London plan. Thirdly, through engagement with the business community, of which I've been doing quite a lot of already, so developers know that. Fourthly, through our connectivity approach, creating standardised way leaves, and I think that's something that's entirely achievable if we put the requisite amount of elbow grease in there. At the moment there's a real challenge trying to get into these buildings and identifying how to engage with landlords themselves. I would say that there is a real role for boroughs here, and not all boroughs have articulated a digital strategy yet. In fact, we think only about 10 of them have. We think we want to work with boroughs in order to make sure that we can have a standard approach to this. The final point, I think, is the public sector as a landlord as well, and we will the way in which the connectivity offer will be available to businesses and residents isn't just through full fibre, it's also things like mobile connectivity through access to tall buildings, of which the public sector is is the biggest owner of in the city. So mobilising public service assets is very, very important, and to that end we have just submitted a bid to DCMS using the work that we're already doing on the underground to identify public buildings around the underground in central London in order to extend full fibre to those premises in order to eradicate knot spots. So that bid is in now, it's for £19 million, and hopefully with touch wood it will be successful. That will be announced in March, and for the first time we were able to convene the councils, all of whom were extremely interested in this, here actually in this room, for common ends. So I think mobilising the public sector as a landlord as well as the private sector is very important.
Yeah, during our evidence gathering for the report that we published last year in June on this subject, we visited 3 sites. We went to the City of London, Southwark, Rotherhithe. We went to Westminster as well. And those are the 3 areas where we have come across shockingly a low level of connectivity. Well, those are the not spot areas. The question to you, Theo, is that the mayor has committed to having the not spot team. Can you tell us what are the team's priorities in that area, and when do you think we will have a brighter picture on that?
Well, the not spot team is currently developing this, full articulation of our approach on connectivity, and that will be available shortly. We've fed into that. The areas that you've identified, I mean, the Not Spot team is an innovation in the sense that it is now something where people can contact you as elected members or elected councillors, go to their council, and things can be escalated, and we can try and find a resolution with providers. And I think that's a good function for City Hall to do. Secondly, it can help develop things like common approaches to wayleaves, which have been extremely difficult for us to do. It provides expert and experienced advice on how we develop policy. And thirdly, the areas that you've identified, the experience of the Not Spot team was able to feed into the TfL bid for full fibre and say, we would like you to concentrate in these areas. So you've identified Canada Water Rotherhithe, which is a really big area of growth in this city. It's extremely poorly served for historic reasons, and that is actually a focus of the full fibre bid. So we hope to actually be proposing a resolution to that problem subject to the success of the bid.
Sean, you wanted to come in?
Just quickly, does this way of responding to not spots risk a patchy response? It doesn't feel like there's any overall mechanism or technical way of responding to not spots. If I ring up and say I have a not spot in a particular part of London, doesn't that risk just a patchy infrastructure development? We've seen it over the years with phones, with sewers, with all sorts. Isn't there some... I mean, it might be the reality that these things exist and you have to do it in that manner, but is there some other way of approaching this?
It's an interesting question. I mean, the way, I don't mean to sort of, I'll answer it in this way, that broadband infrastructure is now essentially seen as a utility in a regulated industry. And so we have to deal with many providers and also different layers of technology, some of which are developed in the future and some of which are led by the market. So the challenge for us is to meet needs where it's needed most. And there are some areas of just really big growth and footfall. And the connectivity report, essentially says that number of connected devices is going to go up very, very significantly, and the data used is going up by 50% a year. So there's an element of us chasing where the demand is, and there's another element which basically says we need to make sure that outer London, where there's probably there's less demand because of the siting of industry and footfall, also needs to be provided for as well. So that's why we're developing a plan led by the Not Spot team to identify those things, and I think the scrutiny committee will have a real chance to go into that and to challenge that. So what I'm saying is that it's a movable feast, but we need to have articulate a broader approach with a series of actions to ensure more consistency.
My last thing, that how much of the response to not spots is part of our future development, because we have 4G now, 5G is coming down the pipe. If we build a antiquated 4G network, is that going to be something we have to return to deliver 5G, or can we start to put in the technical need for 5G right now?
I think the latter, and this is where the public sector estate is really, really important, because 5G will involve kind of sort of iPads, not shaped but sized, or brick-sized, small, cells basically put in various places. Some people say hundreds of thousands in London, and so people will be looking for places to locate these devices, and the public sector estates, whether it's council estates, hospitals, council buildings, that sort of thing, will be, and lampposts, will be really, really crucial to this. We can start to prepare for that whilst we're also rolling out 4G.
But we could, but are we? So I ring up with my not spot in, I don't know, Woolwich, Arsenal, the team recognise it, ask for something to be done. Is there a technical specification that says when you respond to a not spot and we put in any new infrastructure, that infrastructure must be capable of delivering for our 5G network future? Is that part of what's going on?
The planning framework for the future significantly updates our ability to do that.
So
and
that
puts down
isn't happening
expectations.
now?
No.
That isn't happening.
No,
That's what I'm trying to understand.
What's happening now is basically our ability to respond to demand where it arises and convene providers together.
And we have no way of asking providers to provide something that will be useful for 5G.
Oh no, we do. We talk to them individually, and now we're setting out a strategy of doing that. And we're identifying, they have data of where there's poor coverage, and we have data, and we're in constant conversation with them about how they can develop a better offer.
Okay, I think I'm looking for a demand rather than a conversation and how they could develop.
A demand?
Yeah, I want someone to be able to say, we demand that you put in a network that will be useful in the future so we don't have to return. It just sounds quicker and cheaper to me, but I'll stop there, Charity.
Yeah.
Well, I hope, your strategy clearly reflects that requirement, which I think what we are talking about, because no point in, going for 4G and then before you sort of blink, you know that it's really not going to be the business. You need to have 5G and even better. If you can move on to the issue about social inclusion, because quite rightly, Theo has talked about digital revolution and what needs doing to get up to the scratch, up to the mark as well. Dr. Willis, the question is that what do you reckon the GLA should do to ensure that improvement in digital connectivity supports social inclusion?
I think what's interesting, you've identified with the digital connectivity plan, is that there are not spots and that digital inclusion is an issue within London. I mean, I think what we might see from the aspirations around Smart London is this vision for like this hyper-connectivity, but there are issues around just basic connectivity.
Yeah.
So there's a need to align what are two different stories.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I was looking at the Mayor's digital inclusion strategy, and I think that 16% of Londoners do not have basic digital skills. So when we've got an aspiration around, a vision for a very highly articulate digital capacity, digitally enabled Londoner, there's another section of London which probably could benefit a great deal from a Smart London plan that probably isn't really being taken forward through this. So my view is, if you've got a digital inclusion strategy, how does that align? And that digital connectivity as an infrastructure is one way to deliver that. So you can deliver it. But there's a sort of a softer infrastructure, which is, okay, so you have literal, the fibre connection, but how do people use that? What do they use it for? What in people's everyday lives are they going to? Why do they need to be smart? Why do the people in Rotherhithe? What are they going to benefit from in smart? And I've been part of a project evaluating Superfast Cornwall, which was a large-scale superfast broadband rollout in Cornwall, and we looked at the societal impact. Again, quite interestingly, we found the same issues with not spots. So large patterns they're geographically isolated, but they tend to very, very clearly match to deprivation. So digital deprivation is social deprivation. You lack access to good housing. The same infrastructural problems match across.
Yeah.
Would that map the same as London in that our layout is nothing like Cornwall, clearly, and London is a tale of two cities, isn't it? You have some very, very rich areas butted up right against some poor areas. Is it a case that the connectivity just runs up that road, and if you're on the wrong side of the road, you suffer?
I would guess that if you look at deprivation indices, they map very closely to digital skill sets and lack of infrastructure. I can't be sure, but it's a mistake that happens. If you have poor housing, poor health, you have poor digital. They tend to align.
So I accept that with the skill bit.
Yeah.
But I just wonder if it's the same with the network bit, because just of how much we are crammed into.
Well, if you think that digital infrastructure is a market-driven activity, and the people who have probably less digitally skilled, probably have less obvious demand. They may not be shouting to have, So I think if when we looked at superfast Superfast Cornwall was a rollout, across the thing, but we noticed that just because you have a connection doesn't mean you're going to get superfast broadband. Mm-hmm. So, this idea that if you provide an infrastructure, you're going to get people accessing it. Access is a capacity and obviously a financial capacity too. So it's all very well saying you have access to a fibre. It doesn't mean that I've got a broadband connection. Yeah, I've got that connection. So I think there's a little bit of if we think about infrastructure and the ability, what I would say is access. Access isn't just a technical capacity. It's also how that's part of what I need in my life, and that may not be a priority for some people.
But don't most people access the digital network through television? And I'm a big fan of iPlayer. is that? I think the point I'm trying to make is because of there is a social thing here. If you don't have a lot of money, you don't make demand, and your area reflects where your financial circumstances largely. But isn't the use of the digital service so vital to people that even for people with low incomes, it's quite high up their priority, so they interact with it?
I think there's a basic level of digital connectivity, but just because you can access iPlayer doesn't mean you can fill out a job application, and they're very different skill sets.
But I'm talking from a network point of view, because for me they're two separate things, aren't they? Yeah. First is, can we actually get you the service? Yeah. And then secondly, can we encourage, teach, train you to use that service? Yeah. But I could be wrong, but my emphasis is getting the service there first, because you could have all the training in the world, if you can't get to the service, you can't use it. Yeah. So I could have it the wrong way around. I'm asking a question.
Yeah, I think that's so you can have, I can get the service but I can't use it, but you can also I have the capacity and I can't use it. So I think there are a range of ways you can deliver digital inclusion that aren't necessarily purely infrastructural. And I think if you rely on the infrastructure, you can be waiting for something, and there are ways to deliver it in a sort of softer sense, though, through skills. You maybe making community access. I think talking about the use of community assets, public Wi-Fi, ability to access community resources. I think we tend to see digital as in the home or in the office. Why is it not in the community? we should be seeing digital as a community asset as well as a business and in your home. So that's often where you mobilise a community, is through how you enable it to be part of some sort of much more societal scale of things rather than individual.
Last question, Chair. Is there any example of any city, community around the world that has good community access, good digital access, that they could just, I'm imagining, I used to run a youth group, I would have loved it if we could have sat in the park and just connected to the council's Wi-Fi and got on with it instead of sort of bed borrowing and stealing. Is there anybody who has that sort of experience across the world?
You've got it in London. It's patchy. I think that's you've got excellent coverage. But obviously free Wi-Fi is so New York had this program of free Wi-Fi in parks. Obviously, they have a different climate, so that creates different culture. But free public Wi-Fi, Barcelona, Amsterdam, those cities. That sort of. If you see digital as part of a public infrastructure as well as a private, then you've got ways to understand that access is not just a technical infrastructure. It's also how you enable that as part of what you do as good governance. And I think that's so what I think is really fantastic about this report is digital connectivity. You've identified the need for the infrastructural, but as part of good governance, how do you enable that as part of how people participate in the activities of the city, and particularly the public nature of that, particularly in the way that people participate as societal, in society.
And just picking up on that, I think there's a third aspect of digital inclusion and that has come to more prominence recently. I think at the beginning of the decade we talked about, could you afford an iPad, or did you have a signal and could you afford that, and did you have the skills and channel shift and lots of these terms, especially when you're dealing with public services. Now through the work of Government Digital Service, now there's people talking about design as it's almost like the third element of this. So think about what the experience of the citizen is, and if they're using their mobile phone a lot, or even their television, but just for sake of argument, the mobile phone, making websites much more usable around the mobile experience, so that you're putting yourself in the shoes of the kid at the youth club or the older resident, and just seeing, well, what are they comfortable using? So we're looking at it through a different lens rather than imposing technology on people. It's becoming much more responsive. And of course, the use of data and new design techniques, user-led design, are being much more popularised. The challenge that we have, and part of my role, is to take those principles and spread them out across certainly the public sector in order to do that, and also identify specific areas of need. I was talking to one of the board members of Skills for London, and they were saying the new universal credit, which is an online activity. If you're looking at areas of exclusion, go to any hostel, because you'll have people there who work or are looking for work, and hostels are poorly served by free Wi-Fi. And actually, we need to be thinking, using our experience and our data, of looking at those youth clubs or looking at hostels and places like that, of like islands of, they're not spots, they're just not connected, and looking at those who really need it. And so I think we're coming into a kind of a time when we're having a really sort of more nuanced and targeted discussion around, cohorts that are really, really excluded, and what we do to serve them.
I mean, something that something I can credit Theo with is that when he first wrote his digital strategy for Camden way back in 2014, asked the question, why are we doing this? What are the reasons why we're doing this? And he said 80% of the contact with public services are done by the bottom 25% of income of the population in terms of income, and most of the digital services that have been created for, well, people that look like me, that don't use the public services very often, basically just pay council tax and not much else. And how do you actually do that targeted work? And how that design work is incredibly important, because if somebody that uses many, many different services picks up the very first digital product that they have and doesn't like it and wants to interact not online anymore, you've lost not just that opportunity, but multiple opportunities for moving the transactions that a public service has from in-person to online. So yes, channel shift is something that still is being talked about, but it needs to be talked about with design in place. And the whole history of how the boroughs should be addressing their digital transformation programs, or the way they communicate with citizens, is around that customer experience, that customer portal that many boroughs talk about all the time. And after the next election, we're going to be really ramping up in high gear on it, because about half of the boroughs are due to issue some sort of digital strategy within 2018-19. So we're going to be doing a lot of communication and consultation with them to help them get them right.
And it's a precondition of government funding that you have a digital strategy. So there's also an added dimension here.
Okay, we have some detailed questions on update about your work, etc. Andrew, do you want to start?
Well, I think you've touched on most of these things already, Theo, but I'll press on anyway. And the first thing is about collaboration. How far have you got with the different stakeholders, and what needs to be done to improve collaboration?
Our chosen for collaboration. I'll start first with councils, because we also need to talk about the health service and the GLA family. Councils, we propose the London Office for Technology and Innovation, a co-funded vehicle. Our theory at the moment is a co-funded vehicle between London councils and the GLA to provide a general offer around what we think are core challenges for public services councils at the moment. And those would involve how you approach GDPR, how you develop digital leadership, how you approach connectivity, and cybersecurity as well, common standards around that. We think that there are a group of councils that want to take the next step and go further and collaborate around things like embedded technology, or a range of use cases. We think that scaling innovation is a real challenge in London. Broadly speaking, it's gone like this, that essentially a council will have an area of expertise in AI, data, or Internet of Things, and it will pretty much own that innovation, and it will be owned by a certain group of officers who, and that innovation may well leave when those officers leave, as opposed to people expressing a need and groups of councils coming together to explore how you scale an idea or a project across 3 or 4 boroughs. So we are we have developed a paper which has this proposition, which is modelled upon the Scottish Digital Office, which is a collaborative vehicle between the 30 of the Scottish councils. We think that for a relatively modest investment of approximately £300,000 to £400,000 running costs, there could be very, very substantial benefits to collaboration across the city. So that is a vehicle that we are developing at the moment, and we hope during the course of Q2 or Q3 of this year that it will come to fruition. But we need City Hall to be working with the boroughs on this one, because most services that people experience and most of the transformation will happen at a borough level. It won't happen at City Hall level, but we have a responsibility at City Hall to ensure that digital services are ready for the growth that London expects over the next 10 or 20 years, including the uptake in connectivity, number of digital devices in your home, person and work going up 12-fold, data usage going up by, it says here, 50% a year, 30 to 50% a year. So that would be the first digital collaboration vehicle of its kind in England. And we're also working with the Government Digital Service on this, who are also broadly exploring these themes. And that has a slightly different flavour, but it's something that we're aligned to, which is basically how you make the public sector more open and consistent to innovation coming in gov tech, clean tech, prop tech, all of these other techs that are being developed. At the moment, we are not very intelligent buyers, and it's really hard for the market to understand our need. So the next generation of digital innovation will be interested in how they do things at scale, and we will not be successful at this if we still are essentially a super fragmented market, and that's what we appear as at the moment.
Okay. You talked about the collaboration with the local authorities. What about, how does TfL fit into the picture? How does BT and the other private sector providers sort of fit into all this?
So with the GLA family, I've got regular meetings with TfL, Met Police, and other members of the GLA group, London Ambulance Service as well, which has gone through quite a significant amount is going through a significant amount of transformation. We will ensure that there's consistency in approach and language across these bodies. The interesting thing about the smart proposition in London compared to other cities globally is, of course, the utilities kind of lie sort of, in other countries, utilities are sort of like run by the state or largely by the state, and here they're regulated industries. So a really important part of the Smart London plan is to actually provide that demand, if you like, on regulated utilities such as water, to ensure that they have invested properly in data and leadership so that they can be on that constant improvement journey as well. I think that takes a sort of different kind of discussion than the one that we're used to, but that will be a key element of the Smart London plan, and it will be, in a sense, a new discussion that I don't think that's been had on that level or in that way before.
I would say in the past we've been leveraging, TfL's been trying to leveraging their lane rental scheme into trying to get access to the data from utilities, because they charge the utilities every time they dig up the streets. And one of the ways that they've been using that funding is to create something called the infrastructure mapping application. And what that does is try to bring all the data from the utilities into one place and the planning applications. So at least the utilities know when each other's investments are taking place. So from TfL's point of view, you don't have to dig up the streets twice, but we can start to build on initiatives like that and make it much more than just how often do we build that we cause congestion by people building up streets. There's something where we can build collaborations with the boroughs and TfL and the utilities together.
It's a really good example. Also, we need to basically we need to work with the boroughs much better in order to make sure that they share the data. At the moment, we have an incomplete data arrangement around planning applications with all of the boroughs, which is due to legacy systems where sometimes information needs to be inputted twice. It's not done in a consistent way. And if we want to get to a point where we can really see the future of the city, for example, develop 3D modelling tools on developments so that planners can make better decisions or residents can engage with discussions around taller buildings, which of course are being proposed around transport interchanges, then we need to have a much more comfortable relationship with sharing data. And I've written to the chief executives of all 33 boroughs, and we've made some progress, but still there's a sort of residual of 6 or 7 boroughs where it's not immediately forthcoming.
Can I just comment just on that specific planning application, because I know a little bit about this.
Yeah.
And you're reckoning that they're cooperating. There is some movement towards cooperation.
Yes.
On planning applications, on making planning applications available in one place.
Yeah, there will be movement. That's one of the initiatives that has been started in the last couple of weeks. But
couple of weeks. Okay.
Yeah,
I'll give you time then.
Yes. Yeah. Please do.
Yeah. I was as I wrote an application which effectively scrapes planning applications off London Borough sites, and it is an enormously difficult job to do because they are so completely different. So if you're moving towards that, good luck. But I'll buy you a pint if you get near it, may I say.
I'm still on dry January.
I think what this interesting thing about this conversation is if we see digital connectivity as infrastructural and as in a technical delivery, whatever way it's delivered, but it's about governance, and there's a need to shift this idea that actually the way you operate is a political nature of the data and how you treat this as a governance issue. So planning obviously is about how people participate in planning decisions. It's not just a technical practicality of, okay, I can access an application. It's also, am I able to participate in those city urban governance systems? Yeah. And I think if you have a sort of market-driven approach where it's innovation, that's fantastic, but there's a need to understand that smart is about governance and about a change in how you govern. There's quite a significant different pattern of governance if you start to operate in a sort of smart way around how you enable a different model of participation. So obviously you need an infrastructure to enable that, but as part of that technical infrastructure, you've got a different governance infrastructure potentially.
It's a really interesting point. Sorry, Stephen, but it's the when I talk to sort of public authorities about why they should collaborate on this, there's this kind of default position on anything digital that it's about a piece of equipment or an app, as opposed to a way of working. Yeah. It's kind of digital the noun versus digital the adjective. And digital the adjective is kind of, can this thing be done faster? Can it be made more adaptable? And can we share information? And those three things, in a sense, are mindsets about where you want an organisation to be. So a lot of this is about the opportunity of digital is to do things like that, use those techniques on behalf of the citizen, which people have different styles of governance, which we need to talk to them about.
Yeah. Can I ask about the private sector, Theo?
Yes.
Last year we went to see an operation in Westminster on putting full fibre in the estate in Westminster. I think they're also working in Camden, probably you're around. And how are they fitting into this pattern of collaboration?
So BT Openreach have just announced an initiative for London. There's a lot of excitement around 5G, of course, and there are new players coming onto the market with new initiatives. So I think we're in a kind of slightly different place than we were about 2 or 3 years ago. Smaller providers are offering different services from the traditional providers, and also with mobile connectivity, people are looking at different bits of infrastructure to install. So we're now talking about access to tall buildings, for example, which we weren't talking about before. There's more difference. There's a different opportunities with the provision of free public Wi-Fi. So BT of the Inlinks, for example, there are other products on the market as well. So there's more choice, which on the one hand creates quite a lot of discussion, lobbying of City Hall, a lot of sort of challenges for boroughs, I would say. It's sort of like, what's the right product to go for? What's our planning framework like? Can we say yes or no to things? And a lot of, certainly with public Wi-Fi, a lot of things, are, a lot of the revenue stream comes from advertising. So there's a challenge, I think, for boroughs when they, of competing advertising models on the high street and who gets the revenue on these things. So the landscape is more complex for London boroughs and City Hall than it has been before, but the opportunities are also greater. So we're bringing people together in a connectivity forum so we can discuss issues from the big providers and also the small providers as well. And as I say, the connectivity plan's coming out, so providers also have a clearer view of what City Hall's purpose is in all of this.
You also touched on the London Office for Technology and Innovation. Can you give us a bit more information about where it's got to? You talked about scoping work. What's going to happen next?
On the 26th of January, we presented to the informal grouping of Chief Executives of London, called CELP. They gave us feedback on next steps for this. We've discussed this upstairs with Nick Bowes, and a paper will be forthcoming to City Hall to discuss what the proposition is in April or May. Obviously, we've got some election periods, but there's an internal process around that, and that's and the proposition, I think, would be to set this up in 2018, subject to People's Agreement. That would be a model which would provide the opportunity for collaboration on the basic areas that I outlined: GDPR, cybersecurity, some connectivity work. The more advanced LOTI, it's the acronym, work would be developed down the trail. But essentially, a London Office for Technology and Innovation would mean the co-opting or hiring of probably a staff of about two or three to drive that collaboration. And I think we could make some real progress with that.
Sorry, Andrew. So why do we need to do that? Why can't they be in your team?
Because the distributed nature of governance in London is that the boroughs are responsible for a great deal of services, and City Hall are, responsible for others. And the proposition is a partnership approach between, the boroughs and City Hall. I think you need to bring other public services with you, and it would, if you're talking about service design of adult social care, it's probably not appropriate to discuss that in a City Hall setting, but collaborations of boroughs who have the experience of delivering it is. So in a sense, it's sort of like a localism.
Would it sit within London councils or in City Hall?
Exactly. Yeah.
Where would it be? We would think of locating it in a kind of perhaps in a catapult or a place like that. But we haven't kind of gone into that kind of minutiae, because I often find that it's better to get the principle established first rather than often some of the points that people would argue about more heatedly.
It just, I accept your establishing a principle first, and that makes sense. But it sounds like you're going to set up a remote team to work with two other teams that are remote to it. Wouldn't it be better to have people embedded in both teams who facilitated a long...
Yeah. I take your point, and sorting out governance is a really important point. So this body would be run by a board, which would have a governance structure that would be acceptable to both, City Hall and the boroughs. There isn't a team at London councils at the moment. There's just what we have here at City Hall if we're talking about the development of collaboration function. All there are sort of like committees of officers and professional groupings. So it's not like there are separate teams anywhere. It's just we haven't done this yet.
But that for me would make the setting up of a team embedded in London councils even more desirable, because it'd give them focus, help them to keep up, rather than setting up a remote team, which is going to take longer, be more expensive, and run the risk of being remote to both teams. I fully expect that City Hall will quite easily be able to work with that mechanism, but London councils have many other things and no team in their team.
Yeah.
So this team will either end up doing the work that London Council should do, or constantly chasing because they don't have dedicated officers within London councils. It seems to me that the team should be set up there, and then a collaboration should be.
Yeah, I mean, I can guarantee we will look to the most effective setup we can in order to deliver this. Those kind of conversations are basically the ones that need to be shaped now, and I take on board your challenge. We don't want to have something that's remote or that's not as effective as it can be, because that totally defeats the point of doing this. We will so the proposition coming forward will be subject to scrutiny as well.
We'd like to see that, because our experience, let me not speak for other people, my experience of remote teams, they are less effective than teams that are embedded in the vehicle, in the organisation, London councils, that would actually have to deliver most of this. A staff team there would form the relationships with the other parts of London councils to help this all happen. But the proposal being worked forward is being worked forward jointly with City Hall and the thinking led politically by Mayor Philip Glanville from Hackney and Fiona Colley from Southwark. There's a process through London councils which that proposition will arise. The discussion at SELC was essentially, can we sort of develop some kind of memorandum of sort of saying, well, what's the role of the mayor in this, and what's the role of London councils, and then how you would staff it and where it would be staffed will be things that will be developed, because obviously you can talk about new appointees or secondments and all of these things. I understand and accept your principle of establishing the principles and the nitty-gritty coming later, but I would make a personal plea that it isn't a remote team.
Okay, I'll take that, and really happy to come back with that proposal, because it is a new institution, and so and it's slightly different from other ones, so it therefore needs to be dealt with in a clear and quite nuanced way, I think.
But we have been talking, and we will try to learn lessons from example, the London Resilience team that has shifted back and forth between City Hall and London Fire Brigade, for example, and the reasons, lessons they learned from doing that.
I think given the interest, would be useful if you can come back to us when you are at that stage, when you've determined, what kind of governance arrangements you have. It would be very helpful. Sorry.
Last sort of points to raise, Theo. We understand TfL's put in a bid to DCMS, whatever it's called now. Is that the 90 million for tall buildings, or is that a different one?
So it's 90. It's called the Connected London Full Fibre bid, and that is to fund the links between the 4G network that's going down the tube and identified public buildings around those tube lines, which take on a section of the District Line, Victoria Line, Jubilee Line down to Canada Water. That is the £19 million bid.
It's all the same thing?
Yes.
What about the northern one?
This is a bid for phase 2, and there are various other phases that the government's coming forward with. We're really hopeful that this will kick off further steps, and I don't know what the dynamics are of various underground lines and stations and how deep the lines are. That's a question of detail for TfL, but this essentially deals with central activity zone hotspots as stage 1 of doing something, proof of concept, and then doing further investment elsewhere.
the answer to that in March?
Yes, I understand so.
And what happens if it doesn't work?
Well, what happens if the bid doesn't work?
We don't get the money.
If we don't get the money, there's phase 3, and we'll learn from what didn't work in phase 2. And I think that's sometimes how these bids work.
And if TfL is focusing on the tube network.
Yes.
Obviously, the tube doesn't run south of London.
It's
well, not much,
there are elements of the bid. I think it goes down to Brixton, and also it takes on board Canada Water, Rotherhithe, the Jubilee line down there. So yeah, elements of South London. It's not an entirely over the river, that side of the river.
Do you have looking at any of their other infrastructure? For example, the cabling that leads to all the traffic lights, which are run from a central point.
I can't answer for their full connectivity programme, but I do know that.
Obviously, that's not as deep as the.
Yeah, I do know that in scope. I mean, preparing for 5G, we've got to look at all public service assets, whether it's TfL, boroughs, NHS, schools, because there will be a lot of places where 5G will sort of small installation points will be needed. And so mobilising those assets will be absolutely vital to it. In fact, I don't think we could become 5G without the public sector.
TfL's assets, if you look at the traffic cameras and the traffic lights and everything, that's much near the surface.
Yeah, we have
and it's London-wide coverage.
Yes.
Lampposts on the main roads. What about, are you having this conversation with Network Rail because of the overground? Because it just sounds to me as someone who lives far out in London, we're about to get ignored.
That would not be. I can't speak to the phasing of it. I mean, we're really, really early days, but every conversation I've had with a provider has been a conversation, as Katherine said. It's like there's a market-driven dynamic here for this, but there's also sufficient leeway in it to sort of say, well, okay, we understand your objectives, so we can actually shape their objectives, bit by bit towards what we want to do.
Of course, a commercial provider really only is concerned with their profit, but because we have the means to help and make things more cost effective, surely that must be our major bargaining tool. Because no matter what any of the providers want to do, the fact that we have massive roadworks, lampposts, traffic lights, rail, the network rail infrastructure, the underground infrastructure, if that is used as part of the negotiation, we can get a much broader spread. Because again, the outer boroughs are always worried that the focus will be here because that's where lots of the business are, inner London, but yet there's an awful lot of people, millions of Londoners out there. If we're not involved in the initial conversation, then it won't happen, and we just want we want to make sure that our assets are used as a means to leverage services for people in the fringes of London.
Absolutely, it's a tremendously exciting opportunity that we can mobilise these assets, and that's why there will be a specific vision set of measures around this in the Smart London plan, so that boroughs, controllers of public assets are left in no doubt what City Hall's objective is and how they can get together and how we can do that and what the benefits are. I'll just say on tech clusters, we have 40 tech clusters in London. They aren't just in Old Street Roundabout, they're in Barnet and they're in Hillingdon and places like that right across London, and we therefore the demand will also flow from servicing, those tech clusters as well, and we will have more in the future.
It just seems to be strange that TfL have gone for the London Underground network rather than the A-Road network, for example, which I would have thought would have been technologically less challenging.
I would say that it doesn't mean that they're not in other initiatives right now. I would say that our Sharing Cities project that we're doing with the Borough of Greenwich, they've been really concentrating on the case study of lampposts, of how you do co-commissioning between TfL and many of the outer boroughs of lampposts and make them able to have 5G, have more sensors that measure air quality, environmental degradation, congestion, traffic noise generally on streets in London. And so they're working very hard to commission technologies together at the right time, because there's been a whole history of a good technology comes in for lampposts, and it's surprising how many different technologies come on stream so quickly. They commission them, it's overtaken by another, etc. So at least picking one and sticking with it between TfL and the boroughs is something that they have been actively working on already. And that's one of the reasons probably it wasn't in the bid.
How's that going to help get full fibre into people's homes and offices? So,
Well,
that's different than 5G.
Yeah, that's slightly different from 5G. It's a different technology and way of doing things. I mean, OpenReach last week announced a very big initiative for investment in London, putting full fibre to the home, and so there is a new developing different proposition than there was before, which was basically to boxes locally. So the nature of the offer for Londoners is changing because the demand is changing, and we are able to leverage what we are doing with the providers. So when I met OpenReach last week, I was able to tell them that we'd put in a bid to DCMS where we were doing full fibre to the public buildings around the tube. Their awareness of that can actually mean that change their investment to extend the reach of that. So, the basis of this collaboration, this discussion, means that investment can be optimised in London in quite a complex environment. There is great demand for connectivity in London, but I'd also say that we have an absolute burgeoning tech sector which has also grown, and the network has grown responding to these demands. It needs to do more. We need to have a bolder ambition for connectivity in the area, but we've done quite a good. I think there's been quite a good connection between certainly industry and providers so far. There have been problems with it, but we're ready to go to that next level, and that's why it's a really important part of the Smart London plan. And as I mentioned before, it's seen as like in the London plan we've said it is a utility like water and electricity, and so that's the first time we've articulated that, and these are really strong signals coming out of City Hall. I don't know how other cities might have been earlier in making that analogy with water and electricity and gas, but we come in cycles with London plans, and now's the time for us to really make something of it.
I think that the model of particularly fibre as utility is useful, but it's not. You haven't got the same delivery. So that the challenge is that aspiration sounds great. Who's delivering it? And I think you look at. We've looked at. So, for example, the work we've been doing in Brazil. Actually, their smart plan for Brazil is fibre delivery. There is very little. It's not the same sort of smart that smart is talked about in very different terms in different countries and different cities. The Brazilian model is fibre rollout, and they've got much more challenges than here, so that they have a less of a fibre rollout. But the problem is, if you're waiting for this utility, which is supposedly accessible to all, there are challenges to delivering new infrastructure. There's issues of technological upgrades. You deliver it, and then the next thing you've talked about 4G, 5G. I think there's a need to understand that no city is capable, probably with digital, of delivering a future-proof infrastructure that is accessible to all, and that you possibly have to have a slightly more nuanced approach to infrastructure. So if you go for fibre rollout as the only way to deliver infrastructure, digital is not water. You can't get it to every home. It will change. Water will change into another. So I think there's a need to be slightly more understanding that if you wait for the promise of a full infrastructure, you will never deliver it, and even if you do, it may be upgraded by the time. So you need to look at a multiple approaches to infrastructure. Some of them possibly more ad hoc, and more so. That people solving those problems for themselves, possibly through public Wi-Fi, for example, is another way to deliver an infrastructure. So there are multiple. I think basically, if you look at it as in a utility terms, that's useful in the sense of the need to see it as a public service, as it were. You need to provide it, but you can provide that in purely through fibre, through the cable. I don't think that's the only way to do it, and it's seen. There's a failure to do that pretty much across the board because you cannot deliver that. It's very hard to
If
do.
you look at it as if we keep going with this analogy of water, fibre is just pipes. We just need enough of those pipes. My understanding of 5G is you need a good fibre network to make 5G happen. When 6 and 7 and 8G come, surely they're just going to be asking for more of those pipes, as it were, and they'll speed up the transmission to phones will have better reception or whatever, the iPad. But right here, right now in London, we need that fibre stuff. Because if you go to some of the poorer parts of London, I've had it explained to me that 5G could be a way of making that giving them high-speed connections more easily than it would just be to run straight to their houses. So if we had 5G in a sort of public realm, down the street, through the lamppost, whatever it is, all the surrounding houses would be able to then log on with a 5G connector, and that is a way, an economically cheaper way of getting them done.
So like in a developing world context where delivering statewide infrastructure is challenging, you get local solutions. Like, say, for example, in Kenya, they bypassed putting any sort of fibre in and went straight to a mobile network, and everyone runs off that data on the mobile networks. It works very effectively. It's a different type of infrastructure, but so you're not waiting for this state-led, and I think that there is a challenge. If the aspiration here is that the only way to deliver it is through full fibre, I think that's a great aspiration to have, but I think realistically you need to look at other ways which you can leapfrog that and still deliver an equivalent infrastructural service, but possibly through another mode of provision.
There's mobile connectivity, and then there's obviously sort of fibre connections, and the providers have slightly different angles on this as well.
Doesn't that fibre delivery give you the mobile connection? How's the mobile connection given then? What's the difference? What is it based on?
It's serving different customers.
You can get telecoms providers who provide data, mobile data. Obviously, you're paying for it through a different, but the telecoms come. This fibre, as in delivery through broadband routers, that which creates Wi-Fi. But there's also the mobile network, which obviously is a different set of providers. Again, not state-controlled in the sense that.
Hugely expensive.
Again, I'm not an expert on this. It's just in terms of looking at, if in terms of looking at where we've seen examples of countries that are not able, and I think it's true that are not able, or situations that are not able to deliver a full state-led. If the aspiration is to have full fibre, I think that's definitely true, and that should be led to. There are other ways to deliver. If what you want to achieve is people having access to data. To be connected, digitally connected, there are other ways for people to be digitally connected that are different infrastructurally. So the mobile network is another way. There's a different way that people, free public Wi-Fi can come through a fibre to a premises, and then it can actually mesh out to a.
I think that's more what I'm alluding to. Yeah. For me, the cell net infrastructure is not relevant. You only have to see how much data costs on your phone. You could not do that for people with low incomes or people who wanted huge amounts of data. It's very expensive. I'm interested in the fibre network because I think we could fibre to one place and then give it away. Yeah, okay.
But that's done, that mesh, is because the providers, again, this is not my particular area of expertise, but from anecdotal evidence of looking at free Wi-Fi as public service, which I think is really important. If you look at the councils as offering public access can also be public Wi-Fi access, so free Wi-Fi access is equivalent, can be very informational. Is that BT or those sorts of tech providers are not really interested in you delivering your.
Because they're not making any money.
So of course, that's where the infrastructure you have to have some. You have that, and there's very little capacity for what it looks like for councils to go. We want to provide mesh networks. That doesn't seem to be a.
I fully accept that, but my last comment would be, but that's why the use of TfL, NHS. Infrastructure is very important because they can say to a commercial provider, we can drastically lower the cost, eliminate it in some cases in order to deliver a portion or all of this free to the public because...
Well, it's not free to the public because the state is giving us money to do it. But,
but you understand, free use to the public, we're splitting hairs here. But I'm just concerned that because of the comments you made earlier on about the commercial nature of delivery, I accept that, but sometimes when you're looking at a purely commercial model, it increases the number of people who will find it hard to access just on price.
I would say that on the Smart London plan, a lot of things we were talking about before is we start from the position of asking the question, why do we want to have more connectivity? We want more connectivity because it enables people to access public services more effectively, that it gives people information about how the city is performing around them and gives them a chance to have a voice with real statistics and data to say congestion is bad in my area, not just an anecdote. I really can see the numbers in front of me because people are becoming more and more literate with that every year as it passes. And then we say what kind of solutions that are there. And part of the reason we saw that first part around public services is to incentivize boroughs to, if you want to have totally online services and have people satisfied with them, making that investment in connectivity to get that last 15% of people comfortable with interacting online, it's worth their while. They actually can invest in that connectivity and they're incentivized to do so in a way they're not right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think boroughs, the providers would say, and it may well be worthwhile, I don't know if the committee's, had a range of providers in front of them, that they find London quite a challenging environment to invest in. Labour costs are higher as per the construction industry. So a provider said to me that essentially there's a London price and an outside London price because of high demand for just all sorts of construction going on. And secondly, they find that approaching one borough and the set of rules and how they're interpreted in one borough as opposed to another provides a lack of consistency and also add to costs. This is also something people are finding with the installation of free public Wi-Fi via kiosks and whatever provider, is that some councils will have a restrictive approach, others will have more of a permissive approach. Now, the role of City Hall strategically in this is to ensure that there is more consistency across boroughs. Having said that, the size of a borough is a city in its own right if you took it outside the London context, and boroughs have their own rules about these things. But if we can find a clearer, more consistent approach to things with respecting people's localism, then that's definitely, that is something that we're actually exploring. These in the end are just rules, and so rules can be changed.
Okay. Theo, you were talking about the new draft London plan. If we can just stick to that for a bit, and explore slightly further. Looking at the sort of draft policy which states that development should achieve greater connectivity than building regulations which specify speed of at least 30 Mbps. Now, question is, should the policy in draft London plan be more prescriptive about speed?
I'm of the view that the London plan is an extremely powerful tool that Mayor has in City Hall to ensure consistency and to meet the challenges and opportunities of growth. The proposition in the London plan is an enhancement, significant enhancement, and I think up to what normal best practice is. I'm just reflecting, I suppose, Catherine's points, is that we need to have enough room for diversity of provision and future innovation. There are aspects of the London plan that now introduce things that people before, I don't think, have fully, we haven't fully considered. I mean, for example, height of buildings blocking mobile signals and that being a consideration is actually really important in certain areas of London. What steps do developers do to take that? So.
In that respect, and also you got public realm, which is very important in terms of delivery and all of that. Do you think that as it is proposed now, as it stands, the new draft London plan robust enough? Because, I have sat through loads of planning committees, loads of, unitary development plan sort of policy making forums and stuff. And invariably you get huge amount of problems, particularly, with street furniture, etc., in conservation areas, etc. Now, is this something which has been explored? I don't know what sort of input you had with the policies on this
I came at it fairly
on draft
late
London
in the day,
plan.
so, yeah. I saw this. I was appointed in the middle of September. So, from my experience, and that's also as an elected member for 15 years, I negotiated King's Cross, and part of the political team that did that. My experience is this is a really substantial departure and really good progress on what we had before. Fundamentally, when you're negotiating a development, it is down to the skills and expertise of the staff you have to ensure that developments are future-proofed, whatever your plan says. And if I can give one example, which is the King's Cross development, and I think this is a real challenge for planning teams and developers across the board. This was negotiated essentially in 2006, 2007, and started built in 2008. If you walk outside of Google DeepMind, it's quite on Pancras Square. It's quite hard to get a mobile signal at the moment because there was an assumption on behalf of the planning authority and an assumption on behalf of the developers that this would be future-proofed. I think that and now I think there's a question about retrofit that has to go into that development. I think with all major developments in the future, we need to have more skilled sort of people on both sides, both developers and representatives of the public sector, to ask for the right things. This plan gives a much, much stronger steer than there ever has been before about what kind of expertise is needed. It also requires authorities, or suggests authorities very heavily, that they should develop their own digital strategy. At the moment, only a third of boroughs have that. So I think this triggers off a process where people have to think more deeply about this.
Do you think the plan can do with of greater, in fact, I'm not sure whether how much of it covers, but we've been talking about social inclusion aspects. Is this something which that the plan can emphasize as well? Because with delivery, social inclusion, talking about infrastructure is critical.
It's down to each borough to articulate their own visions of.
But we have a strategic role. London plan is.
We can help people through our new vision of digital inclusion. That I think the one you saw was pretty dated. We're now going to develop a new vision for digital inclusion. So when boroughs come to write their strategies, they have full resource. They know what City Hall thinks about digital inclusion in all of its forms: physical connectivity, digital skills, service design. So that when they do that, they can approach it in that way.
Okay. If you can move on to section on Smart London Plan itself now, go into a bit more of detail. We talked about this during the discussion so far this morning, but Theo, do you want to just highlight the issues in terms of aims and objectives kind of governing Smart London Plan strategy?
I will. I'll say a few words and then.
And also Smart London Board.
Yeah.
Smart London Board.
The Smart London Board was appointed in June. It has June, July. It has representatives from business, academia, civil society. They are assisting me in developing this plan. We've held a number of workshops so far. We've developed a proposition for what smart means for London. Katherine can assist, but each city will have its own challenges and its own powers to deal with, to develop a smart vision. the Mayor of London is concerned, the smart vision for the Mayor of London is concerned with how we manage the pressures and opportunities of growth, how we foster greater collaboration by doing so together. And that's, I think, a distinctive London flavour to the smart, to a smart approach. It will be different from New York and Chicago because there's a different kind of government that we have, and we have different strengths. So it was important for us to actually think quite deeply about the powers of the mayor, the role of the mayor, the role of the boroughs, what we really need to do. And this goes back to that London First document that I referred to when it was appointed, Chief Digital Officer was proposed. We need to solve the collaboration deficit here because we're not mobilising the full strengths of London. So within the first 100 days, I've proposed a listening exercise for the new Smart London Plan. We're not doing something completely new. We've had a previous articulation of Smart London Plan under the previous mayor. We were one of the first cities to do so. And the next step is to learn the lessons from other smart cities, of which we're being assisted by Bloomberg's associates to give us a global perspective, and to articulate a new vision of smart, in my view, much more based around discussion around citizen data rather than systems than we have done before. And Stephen will now outline some more detail.
Excuse me. Yeah, yes, please, by all means, let us have details. And also, whilst you're at it, if you can tell us how our sort of plan actually compared with other leading cities as well.
Right, so I'll recap a little bit of what Theo said previously, which is we've identified 5 different areas for the next Smart London Plan that we want to focus on. He was talking a lot about the citywide collaboration aspect, which is the first priority and the driving force behind it. But we have 4 different areas that we want to focus on. One is what we call a new deal for data. What does it mean for data to be open and shared between the public sector and the private sector together, and the utilities that we've spoken about before? How do we actually think about the value that we have as the public sector in our data, and how we can leverage that to the advantage of the city, and vice versa, the private sector, for everyone from the credit card companies knowing how much money is going through our high streets, to the mobile phone operators knowing how congested different areas of the cities are. They don't really know what value that data has and how that helps us run our city services, and we want to be able to work with them to be able to first get access to it, so we can work together to know what that value is. Because right now we have a model where they just try to charge the city for that data, and we don't really know how much it's worth, and they don't know either. And so there's a lot of collaborations enable that to happen. And that's also working with TfL and their own open data, and because their attitude in the past is we make it open, developers go and make products, etc. And how do we work with them to say, well, we do that at first, but now a lot of people in the private sector have realized value from that data. How do we work with them to try to realize that value as well? We have ongoing discussions about how that works. We have another area around digital skills and capacity building. So if both the digital skills, what happens within the public sector in our councils, and Theo recapped a bit of a leadership program that we've established, Everyone as a pilot project to that for the very top people within the public sector in London, but also the digital skills of people in London, and how the reason why we want them to have those digital skills is so they can get access to public services in London more easily and more access to the information they need to make decisions about their lives, and give them more agency in the way that they do so. And the mayor wants to be very supportive of giving people that power, and that connects back a lot to the data and a lot of discussion around GDPR. A lot of people aren't aware about how GDPR in May is going to give them access to the data and give them the leverage with the data that's collected, not just from public sector providers, but also social media, from Google, all the people that collect data about them, how they actually can use it for their own benefit. But that's a long-term awareness campaign that we need to work on here in City Hall. And because right now, if you ask people, data, my privacy, they say just take my data. It helps me run the service, and there isn't much connection with that, and we need to change that discussion and make it much more effective. And I know, talking with Katherine before the meeting here, she has a lot of thoughts about how we might be able to do that better in the future. World-class connectivity is another area that I think we've covered that pretty extensively in the first half of this meeting. I don't think we need to be able to go over it again. Another one, and the final one, is around inclusive technologies and being open in the way that we make them, and trying to incentivize all the companies that come into London and create technologies, both for us and the boroughs and as consumer products, having them being open and inclusive, and especially paying attention to the vulnerable in society. And like I said before, how the 80% of people that use public services and are in need of them are in the bottom 25% of incomes. And they're the people that are often ignored, where the products are often developed with quick payback in a short amount of time, which means people like me are the target, and they make a profit and move on to the next product as they go forward. How can we get long-term investment in the vulnerable in society with digital products and services and platforms for that instance? Now, how does this compare to other plans that we've seen in the past? So back in 2015, I was at New York University at the Wagner School of Public Service, and I did a whole study about Smart London plans, the Smart London Plan and Smart City plans across New York and Singapore and Hong Kong and San Francisco, and interviewed a number of the CTOs and CIOs of those cities. And so what we found was that there wasn't really a typical plan that you could find across world cities, because everyone has their own budget and governance arrangements. And people did have real common objectives. They wanted to get better investment infrastructure. They wanted more effective instruments in public services. And they wanted to do that in conjunction with some sort of trying to big up their tech sector and get their tech sector to be something which really is localized and something that works for that city. And getting interest from the corporates, yes, is part of that as well, the multinational corporates, but really focus on what can the SMEs within that city do for digital public services and digital consumer services within the city. And we did find that there was a big difference between who took the leadership and what kind of resources that they had available, and whether they were really working to the next election cycle or whether they were thinking a bit more long term. So, for instance, the first Smart London plan I would describe as something that's very facilitative, to use an academic language. They needed results before the next election. I mean, I was part of the washing up process before to try to evaluate how effective it had been in 2016. And you put it under leadership of economic development, try to connect the tech sector to and the digital talent that's in the tech sector to, and coordinating a number of commitments that have been made previously in technology and try to get them under one label. That's really the first generation of smart city plans, including the roadmap that was done by the Bloomberg administration around the same time. And with that, and there was a second type that we call really a learning type of plan, and that's really about trying to create public-private partnerships. And the leadership is under service delivery teams that I'm delivering a housing service and I'm going to be driving this forward, for instance. And if you have a pilot project and you want to amplify it and try to uncover new technologies that are related because you've made a lot of awareness, that's the kind of thing you want to do. And there's lots of cities that want to approach it that way. And there are others, such as where New York is at the moment, and places like Barcelona, which are very focused on the systems. What can what can the IT offices of our city, what can they invest? And it's very driven by a technology team. How much kit can we put into the city? How many sensors can we buy? What kind of sensors should we buy? And it's very focused on what we ourselves as the public sector can build in the long term. And where ideally you would want to be, and no one's really gotten to that point in the future, is really an interventionist model where you say, we don't really need to have results before the next election. We want to be working in the long term, and we're going to create almost a living document. And what that the purpose of doing that is that you pilot projects, but you build and scale them up to bigger, larger, more substantial ones, so you can actually test what you said in the first place. Because that's the failure of many of plan making generally, is that you make a plan, but you actually don't build projects that are big enough to actually test those goals and give you the information to remake them. And that's one of the reasons why we're, for instance, putting together the London Office of Technology Innovation. So boroughs can sign up, and not that they're locked in, but close enough to it that they don't feel the obligation to deliver in the short term before 2022, for instance. That they have payback periods that are a bit longer than that, and they can collaborate together to put money together that they wouldn't have on their own to do so. And they have a bit of an obligation to each other to keep going beyond say the next election cycle, and that's something that we're quite interested in doing so. And the best way is always evolving as we go forward. And a lot of the things that I was looking at in 2015 aren't necessarily true today, and a lot of the differences between ourselves and other cities is budgetary and the kind of services that we provide. That's not something that's going to be new to any of you. For instance, the combined budget between the mayor, the GLA group, and the London boroughs is about half of New York City, which is where I was born. And I have a lot of connections there about how they deliver services and how they make their investments. And even if you compare ourselves to, say, Amsterdam or Copenhagen, the combined budget between the GLA, the TfL, and the London boroughs is about 35 billion. In Amsterdam and Copenhagen, which are much smaller cities, about the size of maybe 2 boroughs, about 5 billion. I mean, it's surprisingly high per person. So they're able to make investments in land, and investments in infrastructure, and try to leverage that in ways we can't, and you can see that taking place. But you also have cities like Barcelona, which historically have had very low budgets. They only have a budget about 2 billion, and they're about the same size as, say, Amsterdam and Copenhagen. And they were really focused on buying the kit, putting in sensors, getting public-private partnerships. They had a huge partnership with Cisco in the past. And as soon as the new mayor came in, about 2 years ago, that all got swept aside. And they've been very focused on how do we give people ownership of the data. And that's another response to not having very much budget, that you either have a public-private partnership and try and build up things with that, or you go straight to sweep that all away, and we're concentrating on how people developing what they call a data commons, that this is an instrument where everyone can put their data into a trust almost, and be able to leverage it in a certain way. And yes, it's interesting, but it's response to budgetary situations which are a bit different than ours is. But there's always things to be able to learn from, and it's interesting that the way that things have been packaged around social inclusion are different in different cities. So that one I described from Barcelona. In New York at the moment, they developed what they call guidelines for Internet of Things, but they packaged it as a plan for a smart and equitable city. So all the data is being drawn from the sensors that measure air quality or congestion or energy in buildings. The guidelines are meant to say, how does that data be drawn out, and the benefit and value of it. What does that mean to be equitable to all the different citizens that data is being taken from, and how you get them to be interoperable between those different systems to enable that value to be amplified. and to be able to save money for the city services as well. So I mean, a very light touch example that was given by Miguel Gamino, who actually was one of the people I interviewed when he was the CTO in San Francisco, is now the CTO of New York. They said that, say, our parking system, somebody pays for parking in an area, and the lighting system knows to bring up the lux a little bit more because they know that there's going to be more people on that street, for instance. Those very small things might add up for the budgets of that city. But again, you're talking about New York, where New York owns both the parking revenue and they're realizing the benefits of the lighting spend that's being made on the city and the waste sanitation department, as they call it there. And I would say finally that there's a lot of talk around what does it mean for the research and development that we do ourselves. And there's a couple of very interesting teams in Boston and Mexico City. In Boston, it's called the New Urban Mechanics Program, and in Mexico City, it's called the Lab for the City. And what they do is they explore many different areas and ask themselves, what can technology do to improve all these different ways that the city delivers functionality? And if they find something that's a winner, they do a spin-off. And in Boston, they have a housing innovation program, which is something that's spun off as a permanent innovation program, and mostly around saving energy in buildings and the technologies that go in to help people manage the data that comes from smart meters, for instance. And in Mexico City, their spin-off was their open data platform for the city. As soon as they developed it and they realized it had a lot of value, they said, we're going to stop doing this and spin it off as something that's permanent and go and find the next thing. And those are also inspirations that we can look at of how we can be working with the boroughs and not try to hold on to everything that's successful and try to get them set up in the future.
Dr. Willis, yes. Do you want to respond to particularly the examples of other cities that we heard about, as well as your own comments on our own smart plan, London plan, and their objectives and priorities?
So at Plymouth University, we've been doing a series of research projects looking at smart cities globally. It's not been a sort of very extensive study, but we've looked at a range of them. The initial idea was to go and look at examples of great smart city projects and learn from them. So we've been to Glasgow, Bristol, cities in Brazil and cities in India. And I think it's fair to say, and I think this is part of a learning process around what smart is, that smart is generally not been delivered to the promise that it has. So we found that when we went to see examples of smart innovation and smart projects, we found a lot of interesting stories being told about what cities were doing and very, very little evidence on the ground of actual substantial projects. So, to the point that it became shocking that I expected to see evidence of projects, and we found quite large-scale investments and very little evidence of anything being delivered of value, particularly to the people who need it. So what we saw in cities is generally where it was owned in the city gave an indication of where the impact would be. So it was owned by the economic or the planning department, that would be a certain thing. In Brazil, for example, we saw it being owned potentially within the police, within that, so it became an issue around control and governance. In India, it's being delivered as a government regeneration process. Smart is also whatever you want it to be, and we're seeing that smart is evolving, that it's the innovation nature of smart is generally how we're being seen it. So smart probably will become a redundant term, and we'll be just looking at cities as innovation platforms. So I think there's a need for a lot of caution around what we're trying to achieve. There's a slightly utopian language around smart, which isn't useful, and I don't think delivers much citizen benefit. So what we see, and again, I haven't looked extensively at London. From looking at a comparison of some of the cities we've looked at and how London sort of distinguishes itself. London is being driven through the sort of city as a platform model, so it's looking at working with the tech sector as a way to gather data. What it's excellent at is, and I think that's partly due to the academic links it's had, is doing spatial analysis on data and treating that analysis as a way to inform decision making and future. I think there's an excellence in that. What it lacks is the understanding about the fact that when you gather data from people, because it is from people, that they are citizens in your city, and that they also need to have an understanding about what that means for them and what the benefit is for them. I think, and if you're looking at London as Smart London Plan as a competitive city strategy, which is partly seen as in a global marketplace, and you see that's one way. If you really want to see how London can be smart for the benefit of citizens, I think there's a need to better understand what a smart citizen is in London, how they participate, and what the benefit is. Because I think that's that aspect, the engagement, and also the evaluation. So one of the key things we've seen with smart cities projects worldwide is an almost complete lack of evaluation. So there's a complete lack of memory or history of what the benefits are. So if you haven't got indicators and evaluation, how are you going to know what you're delivering and who's benefiting? So I think the need to sort of just slightly to recognise that there's a lot of value in what you're doing, but there's some bits. There's a sort of a wider context and an understanding about the city as well. So I hear a lot about data, but the city and the need to work at this at a much more local level and to be more realistic. I think there's a tendency to be utopian about this and sort of this future that's coming that's going to somehow be transformative. Yeah. If that future's been coming for the last 6 years, are we here yet? Because actually, this sort of near futures, we had a lot when we went to smart city projects. We heard it was either 6 months, a year, 2 years. Everything was going to be happening soon. We would go back, still going to happen in 6 months. So that I think if London is going to realistically deliver something that's of value to its citizens, it probably needs to be to have a sense of realism, to acknowledge where its strengths are, but also to recognise that at the moment I don't think it's pulling the citizens of London along with it. I think it's pulling a lot of tech companies. And that's probably, if you look at Smart London boards, I don't see a lot of community or public sector partners in that process. So.
Is this problem with the deadline, is there something to do with the people's nasty habit of not doing what they're told to do?
Delivering a new technical capacity within a city is a massive challenge. Yeah. So I think it's just a lack of, it's an over-ambition delivered by the fact that there's sort of somehow this imperative to be better than other people. Wide it needs to look to it. I think London needs to look to itself and go, okay, what can we realistically deliver? Because there's no point promising, so this isn't a fault of the city as such. It's a technological innovation, and the change we're talking about is we're talking about fairly difficult things to deliver. It's not easy.
How do we know that Londoners want a smart city? What does a smart city look like? Because the context of this conversation, certain parts of it make much more sense to me, but that's because of my own biases. I'm an engineer by training, so I like things. I want to see some machine buzzing over there that make me happy. But we're talking about smart and what hasn't happened. But what do people want? Do people actually want a smart city? And in these cities that are, like you talked about, one city that had delivered a lot of infrastructure, new mayor came in, they got rid of that and were figuring out what they were going to do with that infrastructure. That, to me, seems like quite a good thing. You have this machine that you can use, and now you have the conversation about how you use that. I think the point I'm making is there any research, any data asking London what they want?
That would be my question. That would be where you'd want to start. I gave a talk in a school yesterday. They're 13-year-olds. It's an excellent school. These kids are clued up. These are the digital natives. They've been born. No one there had heard of smart. They don't know what Internet of Things is. So if they're our future, if they're the kids that are going to be smart, I don't think they're being brought into this. They're not part of this discussion, possibly.
So my perspective, which is shaped very much by my experience in Camden, and also my previous experience in the video games industry, is, I I mean, in a sense, the word smart can be a bit of a diversion here. What I'm really looking for the city is an active digital strategy, i.e. the ability of the state and the various other actors in London not to be passive in the light of the massive sweeping changes that technology is transforming people's lives, and the power of data, the vast amount of data that's now accessible, and the computing power made available by cloud computing, is not to sort of be passive to some of these trends, but to see how that we can shape it towards the objectives as set out by democratic authority and need expressed by citizens as it arises. The problem with
need. My point being, we have no need that's been expressed by the citizens. The democratic authorities' needs are actually quite simple. They all seem quite technical to me. You know, they need stuff. They need to know where the cars are, what the air's doing, how the river's doing. You know, I mean, what buildings are going where. They need to know that their businesses can use this system to do whatever fintech, banking, building they do. I think the democratic situation, what that wants, feels quite simple. I could be wrong, correct me. I still don't think we have any idea of what smart means to people. I think it's quite complicated, because if you say to those 13-year-olds that you deal with, I'm a youth worker, I deal with children all the time, they might not name it in the way that we name it, but they certainly use it all the time. So I deal with a group of children, they wouldn't tell you about the Internet of Things, but they'll tell you how they use Google Home. You know, they'll tell you what RFID tags do. And I just wonder, is there a twin track here? Are we asking what the authorities want, and are we asking what the people want?
Well, the position I've sort of come from is, I mean, we have a sort of definition of what we mean by smart in the London environment, which on a technical level revolves around the use of data for public benefit and meeting the objectives of mayoral strategies. Lots of engagement goes on what people need and what they want when we do our statutory strategies here. Of course, I'm not proposing to sort of go out and say, at this particular stage, I'm not proposing to go out and say and have a broad conversation about technology at this point. But the Smart London plan will involve extensive amount of public citizen-led discussion about the use of data in this city. So if you want the kernel of this approach, it is basically saying we as a city administration are essentially a potentially massive agglomeration of public and private data, which could be used to capture the opportunities and manage the pressures of an ever-growing city and a changing economy.
Are we really ready for it, though, when we go around and do things like ban Uber? I mean, there's the biggest data-driven application out there that's changed so many people's lives. It's supported by Londoners, and we go and ban it.
But it's a market. It's a market. I think that what the evidence is that if you let the market drive how you deliver digital, it's a peer-to-peer digital network. It's very effective. But if you let the market drive it and you don't have an understanding about how you can own that as a city, then the market just basically gets their own benefit out of it. So Uber is gathering all sorts of data outside of its So the point is, I think if you don't recognise that you also have citizens who you need to, that have digital capacities, that you need to understand what that implications are. So I think that showed possibly a catch up where
also the citizens who use Uber benefit out of it. It's not jealously guarded by Uber. Everybody.
But Uber is the market, the digital market around a peer-to-peer network, and if you don't have some way of understanding what the implications are about how peer-to-peer, it's essentially a sort of crowdsource. The employees are of course they're not employees of Uber. They become.
It almost gets to the point where if the state can't have it, the state won't allow it.
Well, I think without going into the sort of details of that, because of course it's the TfL licensing decision, but made for an interesting first week in my job. Certainly, taking a step back from public versus private, the essential point is around data, people's awareness of the use of data, and to answer the question about public engagement, we have set provision in here for quite a detailed conversation with the people of London about their rights and the potential of data. If we don't understand that, we can't. It's what Martha Lane Fox calls digital understanding. It's a sense of agency in an environment where people feel that they have no choice to use certain platforms that they now believe are vital in their day-to-day life. They may well think the transaction is fair, but they also may feel that they don't have any choice around it. And so the question of agency becomes more important. And I also want to propose this one point, which is a sort of personal viewpoint. As I was a councillor, when I looked at things like recycling, and I remember all these like incentive schemes, and it's sort of, and they kind of were marketed to us and sort of saying, well, your residents will recycle more if you give them an incentive. And they don't like the decline of the high street, so you might get a voucher to sort of spend on Kentish Town Road or something like that. But actually the response of the residents that was aimed at was essentially, well, we don't really like that transactional side of things. We think recycling is a good thing, but you're using our data to kind of give us a £5 voucher. And they didn't respond to it very well. So someone then came along with an articulation, which is, well, using Mosaic, we find out that you quite like the opera, so we'll offer you an opera ticket. Actually, people didn't like that either. What we were looking at people through this kind of atomized network. You know, we've got lots of individuals, and we're looking at people only as individuals rather than members of the community, and saying their community comes through a network effect, when in fact we've never tried. How do we use data to build a sense of community? For example, your street, we've noticed recycling hasn't gone as well. Let's find out why, and actually give you a prize where we'll fund your street fair because your recycling has gone up. And we've looked at data only in terms of like an individual thing, rather than something that people do, and people do in communities. And I think the next discussion around data is also about data and communities, and that's why I think there's quite an interesting moment on this coming up. Final word on smart, if I can. I'm not entirely wedded to that word. It's a bit of an inherited phrase. What lies behind it is a discussion about data and being and having an active response to the changing nature of our environment.
Right. Andrew has region-specific questions.
Absolutely. Can we, somewhere like the OPDC, the Old Oak Common Park Development Corporation, is talking about building in digital services and making it smart from the start. How do we ensure that those digital services are available? What's the route map for any new regeneration development? What's the kind of things that we should be putting into place to make sure that we can realise this ambition of having a smart neighbourhoods?
Could I just answer very briefly on this, and maybe Catherine's got some points and Steve. Just going back to the London plan, one of the things that I actively put into the London plan, which was my concern, is that with all of the developments going on in London, we'll have a discussion around technology, and people say, let's put in sensors to monitor traffic flows or air quality, and they will all be different. And so we will have a cacophony of different technologies where we aren't able to share data or do so securely. So we have put in a provision for the first time to float the idea of a common standard on embedded technology, and that will involve, so that will essentially be planning guidance on what kind of common technologies that you would put in, not in terms of common products, but common ways of doing things to ensure that it can't get hacked and that the data is actually useful to Londoners.
Protocols.
Yeah. And so using the planning powers in order to do that, and I think that's quite necessary.
I mean, there is the BSI Smart
Yes.
City standards, and once you have standards, at least you have some sort of common platform to work within. But, I mean, when I looked at that, I'm not really 100% familiar with the ODPC plan, but when I look at the way it's been proposed, it's sort of taking this model of the marketplace. So we're creating this testbed platform for tech companies to come in and deliver infrastructure. And I think that has lots of potential, but like, who's benefiting? Because actually the tech companies will benefit, which might be a great use case, but I'm not really sure that the people that inhabit that particular place will necessarily be the best beneficiaries, because they're essentially being used as sort of a target audience. So when I looked at the consultation strategy and I look at who's there, I can't see anything that's not a tech company. Or so, you know, who is the community there? Who are the providers? I think if you look at practical things, and this may seem very off tangent, but we have ways in which we deliver data in urban spaces. They're libraries, city halls. That, you know, why are they not a key part of that digital strategy? So if it's just about delivering a technical infrastructure, how do people participate in that? So again, there's another model that I've been working with an entrepreneurial group called Design for Social Change, who've developed the Citizen Canvas, where people get together, have some consultation around what ways can we participate in this development, what we want to gain out of it, what are the benefits we want to get out of it. In the end, that should be a win-win, because you're going to get citizens along with you, and you're going to have an understanding about what benefit people will have within that space. If the benefit is, we'll tell you afterwards because we've worked it out all for you. Yeah. Unfortunately, whether or not that's a good intention, it doesn't necessarily work. That's not the way to that point where I've made something, isn't it great, we want to use it, is rarely functions and is not sustainable because the business plan is not there. So I think there's probably a point of reflection around that, where you widen out what is this plan, who's it for, and who's going to benefit from it, and understand the role of the public sector and the community sector within that process. That would be my view, having sort of looked at some previous smart city projects, and how starting from scratch and sort of putting an infrastructure in is one way, but you need to have a softer social digital inclusion infrastructure to deliver it.
Can I just ask something? The one thing where our analogy of a utility differs with this significantly. So a water infrastructure is a water infrastructure. It can only do that one thing. It gives you hot or cold water. That's your lot. Isn't the power around a smart city and its infrastructure really the software that it uses and people's access to it? Or am I wrong there?
That is a powerful part about it, and be able to combine the data from not just the water, but the energy, the other environmental systems that are in there. How are they working together in the best way, and how they affect the next system? And that's really where the power is. And I was just thinking about what Katherine said before. I myself am in a discussion with the PDC and their smart officers, and known about their smart strategy, kind of when they were finishing it at the time. And I will say that you need to think about your protocols not just for access for what the borough in the future might have for it, or for what the people monitoring planning agreements will have. And I'll come to that in a bit more detail. But how do community groups and campaigners, what kind of data do they get access to? Obviously, there's a lot of private data, which has location data attached to it. People might be walking through spaces, and they might be identifiable. It's irresponsible to just give community groups and campaign groups access to that kind of data and some sort of without being aggregated in some way. But how do you but there's still a lot of value in that kind of data. And how can we think about developing agreements with researchers to look into the way the city functions a bit further? If things are going wrong in air pollution, if they're going wrong in environmental degradation, if they're going wrong in congestion, how can you develop data and package it in the right way so those community groups can use it and can use it properly when they're discussing it? Go ahead.
Technology plays an important role. What kind of technology you procure to use the data. But I would just say, I don't mean to be glib, it's approach, and just picking up on what Stephen says, we have so many different systems by which we collect data. We're just at the moment of starting to assess what we just call our digital maturity. That's basically saying, what do you do? What services do you provide? What systems support them? What data is collected by it? What's the vulnerability of those systems? How do you use this data? Do you have the capacity to analyse that data analysts? Those are the sort of principles of, I think, sort of just some broad principles of sort of digital maturity that a private sector organisation will be asking itself, that it wants to be leading edge, will be asking itself at the moment. And I think all public service organisations, all regeneration projects should be asking. I don't think yet we've got to the point where the leaders of organisations are asking their own organisations those questions, because a lot of leaders just have come in and inherited systems. So why it's not all about software is that it's got to be about, because that's only one part of the answer. The approach is asking those very basic questions. That's the kind of due diligence that every organisation ought to be asking itself at the moment, and the components of leadership.
Well, no, I say I should only ask a question. I mean, it's not really about software at all, is it? I mean, software is irrelevant. Software just gets written from the available data. Surely it's about making the data available.
I think the question is, so if we think about the digital as a utility, that's fine. Okay, but so if you use the analogy of water, I use the water to use my washing machine to wash vegetables, so what do we use it for? Yes. and I think that water is stuff, and I use it to do things that make sense in my everyday life and to have benefit for me. So if the digital is, so if you looked at the project within Park Royal and understood, well, what would we hope to achieve within that? What are the challenges or the things that we actually can make better? So better access to public space, there's a lot about transport. So how can we use digital to enable that? Mm-hmm. Then you've got you're starting from a slightly better position, because and then you can have indicators and you can see how you bring people on board. But generally, to deliver those things, if it's about relevant, there's a need for a locality and understanding about how digital is relevant to people within the context of the things that they're doing in their everyday lives.
Yeah, I mean, it's fair to say that if you write a piece of software with the noble aim of uniting everybody and building communities, in 2 years' time somebody else is going to write something else.
Yeah, and I think there is a danger with digital to assuming that just because it doesn't work in 2 years that's a failure. So
no, it's not failure. It's just
you might want.
But it also
who's using the best Microsoft.
It doesn't exist in isolation. We're not taking although it's a new development, it exists with people who are supported by technology all around them. The data that is held around of the citizens in that area, welfare data, schooling data, all sorts of things, is trapped within, largely, broadly speaking, old protocols, old software that isn't either interoperable or shareable. So what we have is information about people, but not enough knowledge. And the more knowledge we have, the more we're able to design better solutions for people.
You mentioned about the fact that we got the entry into the London Plan. What sort of day-to-day involvement will you have in terms of delivering this idea that smart should be built into regeneration projects?
I will be basically sort of out in London and opening this place to London's public services and citizens to talk about technology. That's why I describe my role as having a large part of digital leadership. For example, in April, we are holding the first unconference here, where we will have representatives from civil society, public servants of all levels, where we will discuss the potential of technology, and we hope that would be something that would be future funded by the London Office for Technology and Innovation, where we get people who normally will only talk to each other in professional networks and perhaps at a certain level of hierarchy. And a point about unconference is it's unstructured. You come in here, you leave your job title at the door, and we discuss the future, potential of technology, the barriers that we need to overcome, and develop a common understanding. What we need to do in London is basically to find ways to remove silos from quite siloed public service organisations and open people's minds to the potential of the creation that goes on in the various centres of brain that exist in London. And so my job will be to facilitate that through a variety of tools, including online engagement. I also think that there are a number of specific issues that it's apt that we're sort of talking about, regeneration planning, is that I think that there are areas where there's some really, really interesting work looking at old processes. Planning processes are a lot like that. And the work of the Future Cities Catapult, for example, looking at service design about how we talk to people about, regeneration projects. A bit of a live issue at the moment. It's like, how do you really understand what people need rather than what they want? How do you have that conversation with people in the pre-application planning process? And I think technology has a lot to lend itself there. So there's certain sort of areas that I think are specific to London and City Hall, which I think we can explore in far, far more depth.
Go ahead. We know that a lot of models get built when developers come and say, we propose this building and this will have this local economic impact, it'll have this energy impact, it'll have this congestion impact. But we also need to ask the question, what is the education impact of it? How do you connect the data from the noise of the city, affecting children's attention spans? How do you actually start to measure local social cohesion, sense of community? How well used are the park spaces and physical contact that people have with each other? Those questions of urban design and that building of cultural and social capital, what does that mean and how do you measure it? How do you assemble the data that, yes, it may even enable people to monitor that and say what kind of social infrastructure should be put into the city? And planning agreements do get made, and I'm saying this as somebody who's a chartered town planner myself, on those impact assessments, and what kind of guidance can we give the boroughs in the future to say, actually, we're able to do post-occupancy evaluations and go in and say, did that modelling stack up? And what kinds of things can we claw back from you if that monitoring doesn't stack up? And even worse, if it wasn't done in good faith, and we can tell it wasn't done in good faith, and how can we help the boroughs to do that in the future? I saw a report that was done by the REBA quite recently that said only 10% of architecture firms offer post-occupancy evaluation as a service at all, and it's just a negligible amount of work that they do. And I mean, as somebody who used to be a researcher in the Energy Institute inside of UCL, we talked about post-occupancy evaluations from the energy demand sector and how we always thought that lawyers would probably always have a field day if they actually tried to enforce the energy modeling and Part L of the building regulations that got put forward by the person that developed the building before they sold it on to the eventual occupiers. And the question is, what kind of guidance can we give to the boroughs as part of our commitment to London Plan to enable A, that kind of planning agreements to be enforced, B, help our architecture and engineering firms to develop some capacity to get some good business doing those kinds of evaluations and having business models that enable that to happen and get the data out of them to help their models that they develop for developers in the future as well.
You've answered the remainder of my questions without even the answer. Thank you.
Okay, Sean.
I've only really got one or two things I want to go over. My first question, really, to the two doctors, really, I'd direct this question to you.
Yeah, feel fit. Unarmed.
What are the implications of our city space being managed and monitored in this way and all this data collected? You know, what are the issues for privacy? You know, where are the challenges there? Do we currently know what we do to, supplant these challenges, defeat them?
I think a lot of it is awareness, because right now the situation we have is that people are quite willing to give away their data and expose their privacy all the time right now. Why do a lot of people put their full birth date on Facebook so people can wish them happy birthday as much as possible? And we need to understand the motivations people have for giving away their data and getting something back and feeling like they need to be getting something back immediately from it. And I think for a lot of people it is very, very invisible, and that's our most important pieces of work, of trying to cut through that invisibility of benefits that you get from how we as the public sector are able to use data in the same way, that the very visible way that the private sector and social media have been kind of giving people immediate kind of dopamine feedback of giving away their data, and at the same time highlight awareness, and isn't necessarily the entire job of the Smart London Plan, about the cybersecurity implications of giving away your data so readily to people in the private sector and social media.
Do we think that ship is sailed? It's too late. We've all given away our data already. Is that the case?
Well, it's part of the regulators. Us as regulators sometimes be able to step in and do it. I mean, I don't want to pick up the whole thing of Uber again, but TfL stated very clearly in their decision. They said one of the reasons why we're doing this is that when we requested data, it was not forthcoming, and if it was forthcoming, it came far, far too late for the purposes that were required, and enabling the sharing of data in the most responsible way between the people who are collecting, both in the public and private sector side, with people who are regulating it, is going to be very, very important in the future.
Dr. Willis, do you think there's a more willingness to give our data to the likes of Facebook and Twitter than there is to the council and the government?
I think willingness is probably the wrong way to understand it. So if we think about the fact that we make trade-offs between what benefit we get from using a platform like Facebook and the fact that we give away valuable personal information as a result of that trade-off, but the important thing is you need to make an informed decision to do that. And I think the idea that people are giving away their data freely is not true. The point is that they do not know they're doing it. I mean, very, very few people know that. Very few people have any idea about, for example, the value of location data. Mm-hmm. So the minute you put your patterns of daily use and location data, you are basically giving away gold dust to companies. So I think there's a real issue here that if we don't raise awareness with people about what data means to them, what they do give away and what they choose to give away. So we talk about this in terms of smart citizenship. If you're going to have people in a smart city, do they choose to be smart citizens? Mm. Or are they being capacity to understand how they use the data? And to be honest, I think a key problem is there's a model here which is based on, we use your data, we'll use it for public benefit, don't worry. How are people producing data for themselves, owning it themselves and using it within the context? So, for example, looking at data produced within a particular neighbourhood, why cannot neighbourhoods own data and choose how they then release it back to people?
How would you administer that? So you make the case, you make the point, that we give away location data, for instance, and Uber, Google can make a lot of that, but could I make anything from my location data?
Yeah, you can, but you probably don't have. If I said to you now, well, here's some, you, on your phone there's this, that, and that data. How you access it would be fairly. You'd need to have some expertise. Right? So,
yeah, but what would I do with that data? I turn off my location services. I don't want anybody following me around. If you look on my iPad, it's on privacy on my phone. But my point is,
that's the unfortunate thing. The only way. So we're public by default. We're not private by default. We're public by default, and we choose to switch off. Mm-hmm. That can be fine. But if say you wanted to look at your impact in terms of how much CO2 you're producing in your everyday life, you might want to look at your location data, look at patterns of how you could avoid certain routes to minimise car use, for example. That's about behaviour change. So you can have location data in any patterns in data are really useful, and you can do that yourself. But we're not giving capacity to people to do that for themselves.
But what I'm asking is, there's a difference between what Google can make use of and what I can make use of, and there's also a realism. How many people are actually going to make use of the data to lower their carbon footprint or whatever? And also, data tends to be more powerful the more you have of it. So just my data is probably of very little use to anybody, even myself, whereas our collective data is huge, and I can't do that on my own. So is that part of the quid pro quo? I give up my collective data because there is some public
But
benefit.
then I think there's that balance between expertise around tech companies and also community benefit, and I think there's an imbalance at the moment in that the most of the benefit is going to the private sector for their own, and they are not doing it necessarily out of altruism. So there needs to be a little bit more balance put back in where possibly a lack of expertise means that people are not aware of what the. So for example, we did a workshop with a community organisation in Tottenham called Living Under One Sun, who have no expertise around data, but they've mobilised a lot of, they have an allotments, they have a lot of community involvement. They would like to know how to use data for their benefit so that's just an example of a particular community organisation. But city councils, how can they, for example, in Plymouth there's a couple of really interesting projects where they've tried to use open data in a way that enables citizens to do. So we've got an initiative called Data Play, which looks at issues such as housing, energy, and brings in a whole set of community, public sector, private sector, and looks at what could we do to use data within our city for a public benefit. So that conversation, enabling that to happen and bringing all the parties to the table means that the expertise raises. So just by saying I don't have the expertise, I think we have to acknowledge that there needs to be an enabling process as well.
So is this built into the Smart London plan? Is there elements of saying we will educate but we'll also facilitate? Because the comment about community data, the word community is much overused in politics. I operate in a number of communities, as does anybody else, and none of those communities have the capacity to hold the data. I'd argue that most of them don't even want it. So is that part of the plan that we would, as a authoritative body, hold some of the data to allow communities to use it?
Well, we already have one of the most sort of popular and highly used data stores in Europe. We've got 700 open data sets here at the GLA. People use it for school places, air quality. It's used by public servants to plan things better. It's open for people to use. A number of public authorities are also developing their open data sets. Did so in Camden, had 300 data sets. People doing things like, it's open for people to develop parking apps, which was particularly popular. Find out where basement digs that was quite popular, as you imagine, NW3, and sort of invention that we didn't think was going to come along did. So, for example, replacing second-class mail-outs for every planning application was then done by an email, and then residents could decide whether they wanted to hear about something on their street next door, back flight path, whatever determinant they wanted, and that put more control in their pockets. I think there's two things. One is we need to have this discussion in order to talk about what the potential of data is. So it's not just seen as the state does it for sort of coercive means, i.e. like monitoring people, and then the private sector does it just to make money. There's a space in between where we can use public data for civic goods. I think that needs to be articulated, and I think those arguments aren't going to go away. They're going to develop further, especially with the new rules. There's a second point here about civil society, where I think there's a particular digital leadership challenge with community groups and people outside of this discussion between the power of data that the state holds and the power of data that these private companies hold. There's this burgeoning youth clubs, community groups, whatever, that we also need to think about how we discuss that the whole concept of data and what it can be used for collectively, because it's a resource that I don't think is used to maximum benefit, but there are all sorts of challenges that come with it. Most prominently in my mind, it's because you're dealing with probably more at the vulnerable end of citizens, when you're looking at community groups. But that is a resource that I think we need
But
to
there's
look
an
at.
assumption when
Yeah.
people use the words community group that
Sorry, I
people,
use the word community.
that people are incapable of stuff. You probably find they can do everything, and the use of vulnerable is overused in my estimation. That it strikes me how Londoners can be more involved, can participate in this, is actually a cultural and an education piece.
Yes.
Because it's about, if I knew it was there,
Yes.
I would use it.
So it's about agency, basically.
Yes.
We want people to have more agency in a digital environment, around their data.
So take us full circle back to design if it's easy to do.
Exactly, and design is a really fundamental part. And you know what? London is a place where people have been on the forefront of designing things, whether it's digital products or architecture, whatever. We should be leading. We have the opportunity to lead this design discussion. I think there's tremendous opportunity for us here.
I think that's it. The one thing I'd say is the socio-spatial inequalities. Do we understand how we're going to mitigate some of those pressures, some of those tensions?
I mean, one of the reasons why we did a research project called Who's Right to the Smart City was that we saw that the smart city not only just kept on with the status quo, it reinforced inequalities, and that wasn't intentional, but it became you're creating there's not a mistake that sometimes the digital infrastructure gets in where the richest are, and so there's a real need to recognise that you're not, as part of smart, if you don't bring a certain set, and actually, I mean, unfortunately, it's a missed opportunity because the people that are most excluded have most potential to benefit.
Right.
That's most transformative. So I think possibly recognising if there are not spots, rather than treating them as a separate issue, if you could actually look at not spots as a potential where you might want to concentrate your efforts and work with them, then, I mean, that's definitely an approach that we've seen before. If you work with the people who have most potential to benefit, it might, you may not be doing that, you may not have a massive, you may struggle to get things forward, but those people you do bring with you, you will bring with you in a further away. So, at the moment, I think if you look at it, Smart London is for a white middle class, really. And I don't mean that to be, I'm not trying to be critical, but there's a slight default that there's a certain type of Londoner who's going to benefit most. And I think there's possibly an opportunity here to go, okay, there's probably some other groups that possibly aren't brought into this that could benefit from it, and maybe just looking at how you align that in some sort of...
I totally agree with that, and that's got to be part of, like, in a sense, it's like why we're having this conversation is we had there's a sort of quite a technical approach to sort of demonstrate a project here and there and the other, as opposed to having a more up-to-date, fuller, more nuanced conversation. I mean, I was totally amazed, to just give you the example, when we talk about not spots, the question of hostels and the need for free Wi-Fi to enable people who could benefit the most from this, in order to get jobs and things like that. And it's like, have we really been thinking about that? Were the same challenges there 3 years ago as they are now? All of these things I think are opened up for discussion, and respecting diversity has got to be fundamental.
Well, I couldn't agree more, but that's why the use of the word, vulnerable. We're so busy rescuing people. We should be facilitating.
Yeah, it's agency. Yeah, absolutely. I agree. Yeah.
And there are multiplier effects for your actions that can be taken advantage of that isn't taken advantage of if you focus on, as Katherine said before, white middle class people. That's only kind of the shallow benefit that you get, not something that's narrow and deep.
Right, okay. I'm afraid this is where we conclude our deliberations. We had a full and it was very powerful deliberations. On behalf of committee, I'd like to thank our experts for their contribution, very valuable input. If you do remember something you want to bring to our attention, please do so in writing to us. We will very much appreciate that. I have a few other matters of business, very short ones to deal with. So if you bear with me on that. Colleagues, can we note the report in the discussion with our invited guests.
Noted.
Okay. Can I ask the committee to delegate authority to me and the deputy chair to agree any output from this meeting? Thank you. Moving on to item number 7, our work program for the committee. Can we note the progress on our work program as set out in the report? We have cancelled our meeting on 1st of March and instead undertaking a site visit to LLDC Regeneration area. And can we delegate authority to me, again with Deputy Chair, to agree the date and arrangements for the site visit? Can we delegate authority to me, again with Deputy Chair, to agree the committee's submission to the Planning Committee in respect of the draft London Plan consultation? Note the schedule of the committee's provisional meetings for 2018-19, which is subject to agreement at the AGM of London Assembly on 10th of May. And finally, delegate authority to me with the Deputy Chair to agree the topic, terms of reference and scope for the committee's first provisional meeting of 2018-19 Assembly year on 16th of May. Right. Item number 8, and we're nearly there. Date of next meeting. The next formal meeting of the committee is provisionally scheduled for Wednesday, 16th of May 2018 at 2 p.m. in the chamber at City Hall. Any other business? I have no urgent business, so I'm pleased to conclude this meeting. Thank you very much once again.